Welcome to Keeping It 100, where we have these open and honest conversations to make sure you get all the information you need to make better health decisions. I'm your host, Dr. Krista Motley, and we have a super great show lined up for you today. So during the show, throughout the show, you may think of questions. We want you to ask questions. We are here for you, so please put your questions in the chat. Dr. Tyan Thomas is here behind the scenes helping to answer questions. She is one of my colleagues at the University of the Sciences, and she's a fellow pharmacist, and she will make sure that all your questions get answered. So please use the chat to ask your questions. Last week, we talked about lowering your cancer risk and why it's important for people on chemo or who have weak immune systems to get the COVID vaccine. So if you missed that show, that was a really good show. Please go back and check it out. And then the week before, we talked you through how to decide between getting a pill to prevent you from getting sick or dying from COVID, or getting the vaccine to prevent you from getting sick or dying from COVID. And so the two options were vaccine or a new drug that's out by Pfizer called Paxlovid. We put a lot of information on the table to help you to make that decision. And for me, the biggest takeaway was that so many people, I mean, billions of people around the world have already received the vaccine. We know how it works. We know what to expect, compared to only about 2,000 or so people who were included in the Paxlovid clinical trials. It's really a new drug. It was only discovered a few months ago, compared to the mRNA technology that's being used in at least two of the vaccines that are available, that was discovered decades ago. And then the J&J vaccine uses another technology that had been in use already and approved in other countries. And so we have a lot of information on the vaccines. We don't have as much information on a pill, but you have decisions. So you just have to think about, if you were to get COVID and you were at high risk of getting really, really, really sick or dying because you have heart disease or diabetes or a lung condition, would you rather take the pill that's only been studied in a few thousand people, or would you rather go with something that's been studied and that's been studied longer and that has been given to billions of people? We know what to expect. They both have side effects. We're not going to escape any side effects, but the side effects that we know about in the vaccines are far less common and far less severe than what has already been studied in the pill. So we want you to just use this information. I'm not saying that the pill is bad. I just want you to think about how to make health decisions for yourself by looking at real, true, actual information and data. The pill is a great option for people that cannot be vaccinated, and it's always good to have options on the table. But what I really want you to do is to learn how to look at information to make the best decision for you. A lot of what we know about the vaccines and the pills come from clinical trials. And so I think it's important that you understand the clinical trial process, because what happens there is what determines if a drug is going to be approved or not. And it's especially important for Black people to understand this process and know what changes have been made since the horrors of the Tuskegee experiment. A lot of people like to say that the Tuskegee experiment was from hundreds of years ago, but it's not. It was just ended about 50 years ago in 1972. So if you don't know about the Tuskegee experiment, it's a clinical trial that was funded, ran, and overseen by the U.S. government. They wanted to find out what would happen if syphilis was not treated. So they recruited about 400 Black men who had already had syphilis. They told them that these men, that they would be giving the men treatment for their syphilis. They pretended like they were giving them medicine, but they never gave them anything, because they wanted to see what would happen if the disease went untreated. And so today we see that the government and the medical community's lying and deceit that happened with the Tuskegee experiment and in many other occasions leading up to today, we see the impact that that's had on the Black community in terms of the vaccine hesitancy that we're seeing. So how do we know that the vaccine that is being given is really going to help us when just 50 years ago we were lied to? So I get it. But I want you to know that so many changes have taken place since the Tuskegee experiment. Clinical trials are not run the same way. And so today's show, we are going to speak to a pharmacist who oversees, organizes, and runs clinical trials. We both graduated from the illustrious Florida A&M University, FAMU. So I'm always happy to have a Rattler on. So let me introduce to you all Dr. Karima Lynam. She is an associate director of medical affairs for a major pharmaceutical company. She began her career there in the neuroscience division almost 10 years ago, and she is responsible for leading and providing medical and clinical expertise to scientific projects, including clinical trials, scientific communications, and publications, and other research-related activities. This woman is amazing. She's busy. She's doing major work. And so I'm really thrilled to have her on the show. Welcome, Dr. Lynam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. You know, when I thought about this, because I really want people to understand how clinical trials work and what has changed since Tuskegee, because a lot of people are still concerned, and for obvious reasons, you should be concerned. So, but there are changes that have taken place, and I was like, oh, I know exactly who to call to talk about these changes. So let's just get right into it. Since the Tuskegee experiment ended, what has changed?
And I'm glad you walked through what Tuskegee experiment was. So thank you. I don't have to do it. But just kind of going off of that, I think what we should start up is after the Tuskegee experiment, what happened after that, and why we have so many safeguards in place today. So one thing I'll tell you is that, of course, the Tuskegee experiment was stopped. That study was stopped in 1972. So when that was actually stopped, there was a class action lawsuit in 73. And then, of course, there was a settlement for the compensation of those families in 74. What will also happen in 1974 is a National Research Act that was actually signed into law, really creating this protection for human subjects. We call them human subjects in clinical trials, and also biomedical and behavioral research. So protection was put into place in order to give some basic principles as far as how do we conduct research and those suggested ways of how to execute. So again, this was happened in 1974. What also kind of occurred is this thought of having a voluntary, what we call informed consent. So this is a document that anybody participating in a research trial has to sign saying that they understand the components of what's going to happen in this study. So it kind of goes both ways, right? It's a board that's overseeing the activity of research, but then there's also this safeguard informed consent put into place so that patients also understand that are taking place. So those are some major things that happened since that time. We also have what we call an institutional review board. So that happens at the local level, wherever you're doing research, whether it's in a VA hospital system, in a pharmaceutical company. We all have what we call an institutional review board. And so this one actually makes sure and ensures this is an outside group that's actually looking to make sure that this particular study really meets what we call an ethical standards. So there's a couple of, I would call pieces that you have to get through in order to actually get a research study off of the ground. Also, what happened in the late 70s as a result of all of these things is there was something called an ethics advisory board that was formed. So again, this came out of all of this kind of work to say that this was not right. This was done. It's unethical. So you'll hear sometimes people talk about the Belmont Report, which was published in 1979. So it really, summarizes these three major ethical principles, one being respect for persons, one being having the welfare of that research participant, the goal of the study, and then lastly, justice. So those are the three things that particular ethics advisory board. Since that time, a lot of things have changed. They've changed the titles of these review boards. They've gone back and updated these. And so now today, the latest one is called the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, and it started in 2009. So again, there's a lot of safeguards. And I know we talk about Tuskegee experiment a lot, but of course, there's a lot of other examples, like you said, that really kind of concentrate on why we have been afraid to do clinical trials people have heard of Henrietta Lacks. There was an HBO special recently done called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. I did not see it, but I do know her story as far as them, utilizing her cancer cells, even named her cancer cells, and do research to this day out of Johns Hopkins because of her, but she was not made aware. So that informed consent was not there when this happened. So that's another, big one. Of course, we know this happened during times of slavery where they took the enslaved population and did experiments on them. One being a big one is we hear of this guy named J. Marion Sims, who was able to do this this groundbreaking gynecological procedure, but he practiced on enslaved women. And again, he had a statue at the New York Academy of Medicine in Central Park from the 1890s up until 2018. And they took that statue down. So we have a couple of examples, but you can also see what's happened since that time with all the different review boards put into place in order to safeguard patients that are getting into research.
Thank you. So it sounds like a lot more than I even was aware about has happened. So we have the Ethics Review Board, we have the Institutional Review Board, we have laws that have been put in place, we have the Presidential Commission. And so there's a lot that's happening that have happened in part due to what happened with the Tuskegee experiment.
Yes.
So we are not there. It's not that long ago that it happened, true, no. but we're far from practicing clinical research in that way, is what it sounds like. And so I'm also wondering, how likely is it that a trial that's based in the U.S., and I'm just using the U.S. because who knows what happens outside the U.S. So all we can control really is what happens here. So how likely is it that a person could be told that they're giving one thing, but actually be given something else, like what happened in Tuskegee? So we have all these changes that taking place. How likely is that to happen now?
Super highly unlikely. Today, like you said, it hasn't been that long, right? But it's super unlikely. And some of the things that I talked about earlier, remember I talked about the Institutional Review Board. Any studies that are happening involving human subjects have to go through this IRB review. This could either be central or local. And so with that, there's also a piece we call the informed consent. Remember, that was what Henrietta Lacks did not get. So these materials are actually reviewed by these boards that are outside of that organization oftentimes prior to a study even starting. So in that informed consent, that's where they tell patients what's going to happen in this study. So that's how we can say, yes, with pretty good confidence, that it is unlikely that the patient will not understand. There's another safeguard within that informed consent to ensure that the language is what we call plain language, and it's at a certain level, right? Because, us in the medical field, we can sometimes talk in a way that, people who are not in this field do not understand. Mm-hmm. There are safeguards put even in that informed consent to say you have to have this at a certain level. And so because you have all of these different layers of review, these are things that are, the concept of a study is reviewed by a separate group oftentimes. So if you have a thought of saying, I want to do this type of study, that's reviewed often by a separate team, even within the same company. You also, we look at funding. So if you can believe that, if we say we want to do a study, well, where is the money coming from? Because if there's some conflict of interest, that gets flagged. Yeah. So you can see the informed consent. I talked about that as far as, you having to have documents to support that informed consent. That has to be at a certain level. There even has to be training that has to be executed before a study can start. So if we want to do a study at the University of Pennsylvania, we have to train that staff to say, this is what you're going to say. This is how the materials that you have to give to the patient. And this is how the study should be executed. And along the time of the study, those things are checked in. So oftentimes patients are very well aware of what they are to be given. They can ask questions. So if you get that informed consent and you don't understand something, you stop and ask the question, and they are supposed to respond. So again, there's a lot of safeguards in to say, the medication or the treatment that I'm receiving in the study, I understand what it is. I've been explained that, and you sign off on that. Mm-hmm. And any questions you have, you should not sign until you do understand. Mm-hmm. So those are the safeguards.
Wow, that's a lot. And I like the external review by the third party. I actually I was just doing a survey that had to go through the institutional review board, and they was like, nope, you can't ask this, nope, you can't say this. So they are like not playing around when it comes to protecting human subjects, like you say.
Yeah.
So thanks for sharing that. So I know that you was a clinical trial participant, a human subject in a vaccine trial. So I wanted you to just to kind of share your story on participating in one of the COVID vaccine clinical trials.
Yeah. And I had never participated before. So this was actually my first time.
Okay.
And I often get asked, like, why did I do it? Because I'm behind the scenes, right? I'm the one that's actually designing a clinical trial, and to then be on the other side, that was totally a different experience. One of the main reasons I did it, because we were dying. I looked at the numbers, and again, I entered that study in December of 2020.
Okay.
And so prior to that, the COVID vaccine hadn't been approved yet for any of the companies, I think, at that time, especially not the one that I was participating in.
Mm-hmm.
But when I looked at the number of cases at the and I'm looking at data today. And this data has been pretty consistent. Looking at the cases, African Americans or Black and African Americans had a 1.1 times higher rate of cases compared to white counterparts. If we looked at hospitalizations currently today, we are still 2.5 times more likely to have hospitalizations over our white counterparts.
Yeah.
Death rate 1.7 times more than our white counterparts. I want to keep in mind also, in the same vein, we make up 13% of the population, about 13%, or some numbers have us around 12.9%.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the data that's showing us today that we still have experienced 14.3% of the deaths due to COVID.
Yeah.
So that's over our population.
Yeah.
If you kind of think about that. So my real reason for sure was, how could I best talk about the importance of taking this vaccine than getting involved directly? So if I could show my people that this is safe, this is efficacious, they would be more amped to join in. I mean, I had even my close family members say, I don't know about this.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, instead of me just like, guys, this is important, I have to say, I'm in it. You know what I'm saying? And I think the conversation changed so much when that happened, Dr. Motley, that people just looked at it differently. Like, oh, okay, well, maybe. And when it was made available, those same family members got vaccinated. So I think what I did worked. I knew, you know what I'm saying? But yes, it was actually my first time.
That's cool. So how was the process? So were you like afraid? How did they treat you? Like, what was the process like?
Yeah. So I will say that no, I wasn't afraid. And of course I probably have some leg ups, I guess, a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But no, I didn't have any reservations.
Okay.
And really it was because I knew, for one, I didn't really have a history of any complications with vaccinations in the past. Mm-hmm. So I thought about that, right? Mm-hmm. I thought about the side effects that were listed for the vaccine that I took. Some of those were injection site reactions, which you kind of expect. Headache, feeling tired, all of these things to me were kind of minute in the grand scheme of things. Muscle aches, nausea, fever, those kind of things. I was like, okay, that's not anything heavy. I also knew that I would be monitored closely. That was important. Anytime you're in a clinical trial, listen, they will continue to bother you over and over again.
Wow.
And so I knew that I would be monitored heavily. Also, because I knew my background of clinical research, I knew what was going to happen pretty much, right? Mm-hmm. I think I understood what phase this study was in. So if we think about the phases of clinical trials, phase 1 is when we're testing an experimental drug or a treatment in a small group of people. We're really looking out for safety and how do we get the dose right for this patient. If we think about phase 2, which was the phase I was in, that's when you get a larger group of people to try it out. And we also see when they compare it sometimes to other medications or treatments, but in my case, they did not. It was only just that one vaccine. But now we're looking at efficacy and also, continuing to monitor side effects. So we had already looked at side effects previously. I knew it had been tested out in phase 1 and even preclinical. So I knew what phase this study was in. We already had some data as far as some of the side effects to expect. I felt that they were manageable. Of course, there's phase 3 data happening now where we talk about after the drug comes to market. In phase 4, we continue in on that cycle. But I knew because this was in phase 2, what had already kind of occurred, what I should expect. And so that really put a lot of my concern to the back.
Yo, you're a real gangster. I
Yeah.
did not realize you were in phase 2. I thought you did phase 3. See,
Yeah.
I've never done a clinical trial. I would do phase 3 because that's when you already know the dose and you know the side effects, and then you're just testing it to make sure it actually works for what you're expecting to work for in phase 3. So I think I would be more comfortable with phase 3. You were OG. You went in on phase 2. That's a little
But it's so large, so you can look at. They already have data, from phase 1. So phase 1 can last several months, right? And it just depends. If the drug is fast tracked, that might get moved up a little bit. Phase 2 can happen over several months, to 2 years. So also remembering that when I entered that study, I didn't know if I got the drug or not. So they had what we call a control group, or the placebo group, where you don't get anything versus you get the vaccine. So I didn't know what I got. Now, of course, because I'm in clinical trials, I know how to find out if I got it. I won't disclose that, but in a good patient way, and I did unblind myself, but that's neither here nor there. But anyway, you didn't know what you got, but I had enough confidence in the amount of information that had been made available at that point that I could go through that particular situation. Yes, phase 3 is the easy one, right? That's the one where the drug has already been approved and now we're doing additional studies in it. I personally work in phase 3B and phase 4 studies. So that's the kind of the clinical trials I'm designing. I'm not even designing before the drug comes to market. So that's a different beast for sure. So I definitely understand that sentiment.
Yeah. So can anybody participate in clinical trials, or do you have to be, have a certain health condition, or do you have to be completely healthy? What can you
It depends on the trial. So you'll see by the different phases what they're looking for. Sometimes they want patients who have the disease or the condition. Sometimes they want a healthy control, and see what happens. And so it really does depend on the type of study, who will actually be coming in. Studies can be time consuming. I know I didn't mention that before, but I'm doing study. I'm still in the study. Let me say that. I'm doing study visits. I'm filling out surveys and questionnaires twice a week now. There's lab work that might be involved, but yeah, they who can participate depends on the clinical trial. And again, that kind of information is actually included in that informed consent. And they set that at the beginning of the study in what we call an inclusion criteria. So they preset of who they're looking for in order to determine the safety of the drug, the effectiveness of the drug, and then also looking at it in different populations. So it depends on the study of who they might actually target.
Okay. All right, good. So how do people find clinical trials?
Yes. So one of our probably the easiest way is you go to FDA. So they have an FDA clinical trial search, and in this particular database, you can look at studies that are done from a federal level, or a private institution might be doing a particular study. And so they're all located there. It's called clinicaltrials.gov. That's clinicaltrials, all one word, .gov. So that's one way. You can always learn about the trial's purpose, who can participate is located there, the locations of where they're targeting, and also contact information. So you can actually reach out to those different study teams. So clinicaltrials.gov is a great way to find it out. There's another one. We know cancer has a lot of studies going on within that group. So the National Cancer Institute is another source that you can reach out to. They have a phone number called actually 1-800, the number 4, and then the word cancer. So that's 1-800-422-6237. So that's another way if it is a cancer that you are interested in, getting involved in a clinical trial, you can actually, because that space is so large and so much is happening in that space, they actually have a dedicated group. Lastly, I know I mentioned you can actually put in just FDA clinical trial search. That is another one that you can just type that in, and it'll lead you to a portal as well that will eventually go to clinicaltrials.gov. But again, federal FDA clinical trial search. So those are the ways that you can get involved. I know I sought out my trial, like literally, I was like, hey, how can I get in this COVID trial? So that was one of the ways I actually took it on. And I was actually one of the last people that were enrolled. They have an enrollment period and then they stop sometimes. And so I was one of the last folks that actually got in here in Philadelphia to a study site.
Wow, that's awesome. So it sounds like clinical trials may be a good route if you want access to therapies or treatments that may not be available yet, and you may be exhausting your options, or you may not have any other options. I think that may be a good route for you to explore some of these opportunities to get involved in clinical trials. It sounds like a lot has changed since the Tuskegee experiment. We're not doing that again. We ain't going back there.
No.
There's a lot of safeguards.
And I want to mention that, I advocate so much for clinical trials in our population and people of color, really because we want to understand how these drugs work in our own system. And if they don't work, they shouldn't be approved, right? Or we understand more that we shouldn't even waste our time in taking them. So we don't find that out unless we get involved in clinical trials. And so that's a big piece. I think the other piece you mentioned around having access to medications that are not readily available, that is a huge piece, which people don't always think about, especially in the oncology space. I personally don't work in oncology. However, there are treatments that are being made available and breakthroughs that really could be helpful for other folks to be involved in, that may, allow them to extend their life or go into remission that, your insurance company may not necessarily pay for. So it's a great way to get access to treatments. And let me tell you, we behind the ball. There's other people that have been involved in clinical trials since day one and getting help that we haven't sought out. So that access piece is super huge, but then also having those learnings. And again, if you're not comfortable with a study, you can get all the way up to the point where you've been talking to folks. And if it doesn't feel right to you, something's just not being answered, it's okay to walk away too. So, you're never locked in as a clinical trial participant, but it does not hurt to explore and to understand more about that area.
Yeah, absolutely. Can people get paid for being in clinical trials?
Good question. So we don't really consider it being paid. Okay. We call it more of a reimbursement for the time. So if you think about it, there are trips. Like I said, I have to go up to a hospital to meet with the study group. So that's my travel. That's my time. So you're really reimbursed according to your time, the time it takes to travel to these appointments, time it takes to fill out questionnaires. I told you I have an app that I'm filling out a questionnaire twice a week. So I'm reimbursed for my time for that. I'm reimbursed for my time for giving up blood. So they do blood work. They do lab levels for me just to see how my viral load is happening within my body as we continue along this COVID, time. So again, you are compensated for your time to be involved. There's a whole algorithm that's done to kind of help to decipher how much someone should be reimbursed for their time. But you are being reimbursed only for your time that is sufficient for completing that study.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. That's awesome. So this was really good. Thank you for sharing, for enlightening me, for enlightening all of us. I hope this was helpful to the listeners today and help you feel a little more comfortable with the clinical trial process and a little more knowledgeable about the clinical trial process and opportunities for you or your family members to get involved, because we need our people in these trials. Now, if you have questions about the vaccines, you can always call or text me at 267 267-322-0470. Again, 267-322-0470. You can always call or text me there if you have questions or concerns about the vaccines. Now we're going to end the show, but we'll take a few minutes to go through the chat and make sure that all of your questions were answered, because that is the most important thing to me, is that your questions are answered and addressed. So thanks for tuning in today. We'll see you next week. I don't know what the topic is because I just don't know. I'll figure it out today or tomorrow and I'll post it. So join us next week for something good. Thanks for tuning in. See y'all.
Bye.